Okay. Well, we might have some people join us throughout, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to mute everybody, and if you would just keep yourself muted throughout so that everyone can hear, that would be wonderful. My name is Jamie Southern. I'm Operations Director for Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a nonprofit literary arts organization based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Ishmael was originally supposed to come to our bookstore before so much happened in the world. So we are just grateful and thankful that you're still able to join us from a distance. I would like to invite everyone to post any questions that you might have for Ishmael in the chat box. We will get to those a little bit later, but please feel free to ask your questions. And just a reminder to be respectful throughout the event. Okay. I did mention just a second ago about the protests, and I do want to acknowledge that there's a lot going on in our world, in our cities and our neighborhoods right now, and a lot of people hurting. So I do appreciate you being here with us tonight. I feel that stories are a powerful way to connect us, to help us empathize, to help us learn about people who are different from us. And stories can make us all better. So I'm really doubly thrilled that we have Ishmael Beah here to talk to us about his new novel, Little Family, which is beautiful. My favorite book of 2020, and a really good book for where we are right now, I think, in time. So we got lucky with that. So I have a few questions. I know that all of you will have some questions as well. But I think first, if we could maybe get you to talk to us, Ishmael, a little bit about Little Family and how you came to write this story, and tell us a little bit about your journey. And then in a little bit, we can get to questions.
Me unmute myself. Absolutely. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for joining. As Jamie said, it is incredibly uncertain times in human history, both for the pandemic and for what's going on in this country and globally, what has always been going on. But also, as she said, that for me, when I started writing, I started doing so specifically to open a small window into the lives of the other people we may think are too far removed from our lives, but there's always an interconnectedness to all of our humanity. And I have always written to open those little windows and doors to remind people that we are each other's keepers, that once we forget that, the world starts to crumble in front of our eyes. And that's actually what's happening, unfortunately. But I also am somebody who believes, and I grew up knowing very well firsthand, that stories are medicine. Medicines that are poured into humanity to strengthen us, to give us resilience to survive circumstances that we face beyond our imagination. So I do hope that when you've read the story, you're able to draw certain things from it. Whenever I write, I feel in a way, I want to honor the oral tradition that I grew up in, which is that everything that I write has to be something that elevates humanity a little bit. So I don't just write for the sake of writing beautiful sentences, which I still do in my books, but I want people to walk away from my stories learning or appreciating something more about who they are or what they want to be and all of these things. Um, we'll get to the book. But the writing of this book really came about because I wanted to answer the question of freedom. What does freedom means for young people, particularly on any given African country, but generally around the world. So you have 5 characters in Little Family who, for various reasons, have ostracized themselves from society and decided to live at the margins of it because it no longer worked for them, which is very reminiscent of where we are. And through that, they still have to interact with regular society, and so they come in. So these 5 characters, Kudimata, Eliman, Namsa, and Devwe, and Bindi, would come into the world, and you get to experience this world through them. Through that experience, also, you get to see what it means to be a young woman in a given African country or generally in the world, trying to really unapologetically be a woman, which I have observed through my own wife, but through also other people who are women in my life, that there's always this point in the life of every woman where you have to decide how to care for those you love and yourself. And oftentimes, most people make the sacrifice to care for those they love and forget themselves, you know. And as a father of 2 daughters, I want my daughters to choose themselves if it comes to that, you know. So the writing of Kudimata came out of that desire. How can I create a character that's going to be unapologetically be who she wants to be? But when I had wanted to answer this question about freedom, I started observing. You know, I've lived in various countries on the African continent and elsewhere in the last 5-6 years or so. But one time I was going back to Sierra Leone, my country, and I was landing, and on the side of the runway, you know, usually you don't get the luck to land during the day because the planes are usually delayed in Europe. It seems like a long time ago when planes were a thing that you can get on, you know. Um, when you would get on a plane and it will land, usually it's at nighttime, so you won't see anything. But on one occasion, I was fortunate enough to land during daytime, and I was able to see on the side of the runway this old airplane that was beautifully camouflaged in this foliage, but it was kind of refusing to be forgotten in a way that it was sticking itself out. And they caught my attention. I thought to myself, wow, this is the place where I want to put those characters, because this is a relic of the country's past. It's the history of the country. So if you have people who are removing themselves from that reality, how do they also take the history and the burden of history that comes with doing that? So I decided that would be the location. And I started writing. Every time I went back home, I would look at that plane. I would look at that plane. I would look at that plane. And I even at some point went in there, tried to see what it is, which is usually post 9/11. It's not necessarily a very good idea to try and walk around the perimeter of an airport. People would not think that you're a writer trying to do research. They would come up with other explanations. Anyway, but you know, I was able to find a way to get to it, and so I started imagining this world through that discovery. And also, for I mentioned Kudimata's character. Also, I was living in Senegal with my family, and my first daughter, who's now 6 at the time, was about a year and a half old, and we were crossing from Gorée Island into Dakar. We were on a boat, and there were these men, you know, older and younger men. They were just chatting, and it's one of those very general things that people do. Usually they're talking loudly enough so you can hear what what they're trying to say, even though they're not engaging you. And they were basically saying about, you know, we know she's a girl, but why don't they pierce her ears so we know that she's a girl immediately? And this really tormented me as a father. And since I became a father, I realized that the world is made for men to succeed in it. Every avenue. I don't think you realize that until you become a father, if you allow yourself to have the eyes, you know. And so that really tormented me a lot, you know. I worked very hard not to throw them overboard in the boat, you know, because I thought to myself, what business is there for a man to decide how a girl or a woman should express themselves in any way, you know? So this fed into the writing of Kudimata. So every experience really came from that. The writing of this book, I lived in Mauritania, I was living in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone, and in Los Angeles. And other places in between. So all of these places fed into my imaginative capacity to be able to write the characters the way the way I did, by also interweaving a little bit of history and questioning what history means to someone who is trying to seek freedom. So when you meet these characters, as you've all done, you realize that to survive in certain environments for young people who are the margins of society, you have to be an economist, a psychologist, an anthropologist, because every day of your life, you have to go through so many things to survive. So I wanted to show their brilliance, and I wanted to also to show the beauty of the lives they have, and also how that lives intersect with cosmopolitan African cities that most people don't usually hear about, where you have very affluent people who can travel to the West for just holiday but go back, and how their lives are. And that's enticing to young people who are the emergents who want to be like them. So then you bring in those kinds of discussion. So this is really, this was the idea behind the book. But lastly, really, it was the question I was asking about family, the unconventionality of family, really, about basically how, how do we bond together to survive circumstances that we face? For example, all of us now during COVID times, where whoever you are quarantined with, whether it's a dog, whether it's, that becomes your new little family. And throughout our lives, we form our own little families to do things. If you want to set up a company, you find people who have the same value system for setting up that company. If you want to accomplish a project, whatever you do, you always find the little families that are not necessarily blood related, but they will help you to succeed and to survive whatever situation you're facing. So in a way, when I wrote it, I didn't know COVID was coming. So when COVID happened and my publisher and I had a discussion about whether we should publish it or postpone it, and we agreed that we should because we felt that it was a necessary book for people to read now. But also, I come from crisis. I've survived so many different crises, just one or the other. So it's kind of like, well, I know very well that life doesn't stop during crisis. You still continue to live. You just find a different way of living, So in a way, it was also like, let's continue that resistance. Art itself is a resistance to continue putting this work back into the world, as opposed to waiting, If we had waited, look at what's happening in the world now, you never know what the next thing is. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and then I will stop talking about the book, and then we can start with questions about the fact that when 2020 started, 3 days into it, we thought we had seen the worst of 2020, right? The US was about to go to war with Iran. There was all kinds of things. So we thought, okay, whew, that was close. And then it just kind of fell apart from there, So in a way, you never really know what life is going to throw at you. But I strongly believe that stories as medicine would always prepare you so that that breakage is not shattering in a way, that you have something within your veins to be able to withstand what happens to you. So anyway, thank you for reading this book. And, I think I will stop there. I have way more to say about the book itself, but obviously I don't want to just go on because I want to have a conversation and honor this moment that we have together. So I guess if Jamie would ask me more questions, and then we'll answer your questions as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's interesting to hear you talk about the book. I haven't been able to read or listen to a lot of interviews yet of you on your book tour because of everything that's happened. So it's still so new. So it's just a real treat to get to hear you talk. I have several questions, but we really do want to hear from you guys too. So feel free to put them in the chat. Sarah has left a very sweet message there for you too. But I guess I will start with a few until we get some more from others. So you've talked about when you were writing your memoir about how you wanted to write about something that people think is removed from their own lives. And you wanted to put a human context on it. I thought that with Little Family, you did a great job with that as well. The choice of making your characters' children, especially for me, helped really humanize this story. Were your characters always children in your mind? Did that come first? Did that evolve as you were writing? How did you make the decision to concentrate on these children and their ages?
Well, I mean, for me, I think when I wanted to answer the question of freedom, I thought the best characters to answer that question through would be young people because they still have a lifespan. They still have the possibility of growing. They have taken on certain ideals, but they can undo them or they can constantly recreate themselves. If I had picked characters that were much older, it means that they have formed their value system. So it would be more difficult to explore things through them. So that was my thinking. And also as a young person nowadays with technology and with everything that's going on, you have your own value system wherever you live or your own morality, but then you also have an import of other ideas through technology. So you're constantly bombarded about what liberty means to you, really, right? So for young people, I think I felt that they were the most dynamic characters. They were the most multifaceted characters to be able to delve into this particular way, to answer this question. So the way I usually write is that I know every writer has their own mode. Is that when I want to write a story, I think of a question I want to answer or an idea I want to explore, and then I think of the characters. And I will spend maybe 6 months to a year just thinking about the name of the characters, their gender, age, where they inhabit. And I would just make notes. I would not decide where the story is going to go. Because I believe that once you make a decision, you kind of limit yourself from the possibilities that come from the magic of actually inhabiting the characters and allowing them to tell the story through you. So I walk around for 6 months and then one day I would just sit and I would start writing. And I would just write. I would not have any idea where it's going, but I would have been in the character's mindset so much that they tell me their stories. And I'd make these connections that I don't even realize. And then when I reread it out, I would say, wow, okay, that was nice, Then I would keep it. Or that was horrible, and then I'll take it out. So, so that's usually how I'm able to do that. But I always find young people the best characters. Families are always interesting to write about because families have every component you can think of. They're crazy, they're nice, they are completely insane. They have everything you need for great fiction. So I always try to. So this is where I go to, at least maybe it's just my experience with family has been like that. But anyway, it's just so I always go to those places and then I have more to play with, in that sense. Yeah.
So to me, I feel like Kurimata kind of emerged, her voice emerged for me very strongly. I was curious if she was inspired, specifically if her character was inspired by any of the children that you've met, maybe with your UNICEF work or somebody from your own life. She's such an interesting character and such a strong child, but clearly, like all five of the children have gone through a lot and have experienced a lot. So I was just curious, or I guess if any of the children specifically were based on anybody that you've met.
They were all inspired by a composite of things I've observed, and then I made my own imaginative conclusions to some of them. But for Kurimata particularly, I think I wanted to debunk the idea of this very docile, weak African girl or African woman, because often that's what's presented, but I've never met one that's as such, because if you think about it, you have African women who are in these environments where they're taking care of family and they live on $5 a day, but they manage to make it work. These are great economists, most people will not be able to do anything. Just the thought of it would give them psychological breakdown. But yet, so for me, I think it was more with how do I get this character? But also I wanted to really get on the idea of what is intelligence, because I don't think there's education and then there's natural intelligence. I think a lot of you can learn a lot of things from going to school, but there's a natural intelligence that comes with just living and being able to be, So I also wanted to honor that. So those were the things I was bringing. So I observed things in places that I've been and try to bring it to all my characters. For example, with one of the characters, which is he's always had the earbuds in his ears and he's not connected to anything. And this really came, that specific image came from the fact that I was once on a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador mission in Central African Republic. And they had a war there still going on, and we were in a remote area negotiating the release of children from armed groups. There were lots of people with weapons, and this village that has been taken over by this armed group, and there were children standing around witnessing this negotiation. And there was a boy who, in the midst of this serious discussion, he distracted me completely, and I really tried to pull myself together but there was something about this boy that was so remarkable, because what he had done is that he had molded earbuds from clay, and he had one in each ear, and he had equally molded a smartphone that he held in his hand from clay, and he was standing there shaking his head like this while all these people are going around with their weapons. And I thought to myself, well, this boy is going to survive no matter what happens here, because he won't allow his imagination to be shackled at all. He's left this place, and I thought to myself, the whole time I'm thinking, should I ask him what he's listening to? I would really love to know what song he's listening to, because, he doesn't need iTunes, iCloud, whatever. He's listening to his own songs, his mind is his own engine, So for me, this really took me, so that infused the character that I wrote based on that. So places I've been all played a role in kind of shaping the characters,
That's great. I think that spirit was definitely captured in all the kids, their ability to escape whatever situation that they'd encountered that day in the village, in the market, and enter into their own private world, and really of imagination too. So that's that's really great. That kid definitely is a survivor. So we do have a few questions here from some of our attendees. Lori asked, what languages do you speak, and what language do you usually write your books in?
I speak a lot of languages, which kind of comes with where I grew up. And if you're born in any given African country, you probably are born with at least 3-4 languages from your childhood. My early first language is Mende, but in Sierra Leone, I speak 7. Sierra Leone has 15 languages and 3 dialects. I speak 7 of those languages and the 3 dialects. So that's 10, and I speak English. Clearly, I'm speaking English to you, so that adds to that. I speak French, and my wife is French, Congolese, and Iranian. So I'm learning Farsi because my children speak Farsi. So I'm learning that. So yeah, I guess once your brain is being wired to pick up languages, you kind of just pick up the rest as you go along. But it's very interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day about this, that when I write, there's kind of a labor of love, because even though I lived in a predominantly Anglophone country right now, and sometimes in Francophone ones, when I'm writing, my characters never speak English or French to me. They always speak one of those 7 languages I know from my childhood. So when I imagine the characters, they're not speaking English, but then I have to translate what they're telling me as I'm writing them. So which is really interesting. I keep waiting for that day when some character will speak English to me. And I think that will be my American novel that's set in the US. That's when I know, okay, this one is funny. But somehow they never do, So sometimes I always think about it, like, when is one of them gonna be like, hello, Ishmael, I would love to be on that page, But so that's always really interesting, as somebody who English is not a first language, writing from all those, which also really, I think it also lends to the way I approach sentences and describe things, because I'm always trying to find the English equivalent of how the characters are feeling and how they're thinking, what their psychological landscape is. and that in itself, I think, shows on the pages. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a difficult task to translate from one to another. So, um,
It is actually, it's becomes easy because it's always been like that, but also even in my daily life it's like that. Like, I mentioned, so in my household we speak English, French, Farsi, Mende at any given time depending on who's in the room. So we will start a conversation and we just go from this to that. So I'm kind of used to sort of being schizophrenic with languages, like, and my children kind of have that. If we're somewhere and they want to tell me something they don't want anybody to know, they will size the room up and they will pick a language that they know and nobody's going to understand. And so it's kind of become to them, even to them, I think they kind of picked it up that, we have our little secrets. We want to say something.
mhm.
So it's kind of, it's part of my existence as well, in a way.
That's great. I'm incredibly jealous of that, uh, and what a gift to give to your children, to be able to learn so many languages right from the start. So let's see. Jackie is asking. You mentioned moving around so much in your life. Can you talk about what took you around so much? I imagine a lot of it with your work with UNICEF. Um, what else has drawn you around the world?
Well, we are a very nomadic family, and my wife is also works for the United Nations. She's a child protection specialist, so she's one of those people, very few of them, who goes and negotiate the release of children from armed groups in various countries. So because of our work, we also get to move every 2 years to live in different countries. But we also love doing that. So even when we're not doing that work, we still move around. We live anywhere for 2 years, we get bored and say, let's find something new. So even the children, like we live in LA now, and even before all of this, they were like, when are we going to the next adventure? We don't like LA anymore. We want to go somewhere. So they kind of also just have been conditioned that way. So for both for work and just for just who we are, we move around a lot because I really believe that traveling and being in different cultures and what it teaches you is you can never get from going to school at all. Just living in a different culture and immersing yourself into it and learning the language, learning how the behavior and everything, it's kind of opens up your world, and even how you imagine things. So we do that a lot. So, and for my UNICEF work, I travel. For my writing work, I travel. So actually, this is the first time in a while that I've been in one place. So it's been a quite welcome thing in a way, even though not COVID as particularly, but for me, just being home, being able to spend time with my kids more, because usually I'm around, even I'm traveling a lot, so it's been nice in that sense.
I think certainly it's influenced your writing, to be able to have all of that experience from so many different cultures. So Joy is asking, can you tell us how your creative process differs when writing a personal story of your crisis survival versus the creative process you were just describing of writing the characters from your imagination?
Well, for my first book, which is a memoir, it was something I knew the story, and I was very reluctant to go to the story for obvious reasons of what it would do to me. So, uh, in that sense, it's different from writing fiction because I create the world, and I can't wait to get back into it, and I can play with language more. I can do a lot of things that I cannot do when you're writing a memoir. That being said, there's a commonality, which is that every story that you write, I believe, has to be compelling so that the reader is able to stay in the story. If you lose the reader, they want to go do something else before they come back to the book, then you're not doing justice to how you're rendering. So when I write, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I want the reader to feel the places, to smell the places, to be uncomfortable with the places. Whatever the feelings I'm trying to evoke, I want it to be felt in a very tactile way. So, But one of the things that I learned when I was writing nonfiction is that I was writing nonfiction that was set in a different environment from where I was living when I was writing it. And so I'll explain what that means, because in the African tradition context, storytelling context, there is no singularity in truth. Truth is plural. But when you're writing a nonfiction or memoir like I did, from the Western standpoint, particularly the journalists and the reviewers, they want the facts to be singular. They want everybody who witnessed that event to have the same recount of it, but it's impossible. For example, we're all here tonight. If we all went back and decided to write about tonight, all of our writings would be very different, but yet they'll be very truthful to the fact that we were all here tonight. Because when people experience things, what people don't realize is that when you experience things, your reaction is based on layers and layers of who you are, what you know, what you've been, the places you've seen. So your reaction is based on those things. So you can't expect everybody to have the same reaction, right? So that was really difficult for me writing the memoir, because people would say, and lastly, when most people who write memoirs, when they're living the life that they usually write about, they don't think they're going to survive it. So you're not recording yourself. I wasn't running from people and saying about, okay, it was June 5th, let me write it down and let me take a photo. When journalists insert themselves in situations to write about it, they have those luxuries, right? So when I was writing, it was very difficult to be put to all those measures. Where I'd be like, I remember this, I know it, but they were like, can you prove it? And I'm like, well, no, I can't. I didn't think I was going to survive it, you know. In fact, that's how I started writing. When I came to the US, I was adopted in a white Jewish family in New York. And they decided to enroll me in school. And I entered the United States with just a passport in hand and nothing. I had nothing, just my passport. And so most of the schools wanted a report card to show that I had been in school. And I was like, I know I have been in school. Isn't that sufficient? They said no. And I was like, well, I really cannot provide a report card for you, because when you're running for your life, you're not thinking, you know, I should take my report card. This is the most important thing I should be worried about right now, you know? You know, so obviously most schools were like, okay, that's enough. They didn't take me. So I wrote an essay that was called Why I Do Not Have a Report Card. And in that essay, I explained that some people don't have certain proofs of their existence because of where they're coming from, but that doesn't mean that what they remember in their memory is inaccurate, you know? And that essay got me a scholarship to university and to high school and university and all of these things. But so that's how I started seeing the power of words to bring back the things I could not provide, you know? So in that sense, when I was writing the memoir, it was very difficult because people say, well, how do we know you were there? And I was like, well, I was there. I don't know how else to prove it to you, you know? But so it was difficult in that sense. So I decided, since then I thought, you know, fine, I'm not writing any more of these personal things. So over the years, everybody's been asking, when are you writing the sequel? And I'm like, not anytime soon. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the next book I'll do it, and then I will stop for until, if I live to be 100 years old, then I will write the autobiography, you know, and it will be one line, he lived, and goodbye, everybody. Anyway, sorry, I'm just going on there.
I can't imagine what that experience must have been like for you to, first of all, have the courage to write your story, to write it so eloquently, and then to have people question that. Just seems crazy and cruel to me, but that must have been a very difficult situation.
I realized that it was, you know, I mean, I think my very existence was questioned because, first of all, I think people did not expect a kid like me coming from an African country that was destroyed at the time during the war to have any intelligence. Then on top of that, I was that kid who went through war and was traumatized. So then I was even more disbelieved in my, you know. So even sometimes I've been to readings where people, you know, I will speak and then people say, well, I wasn't expecting that, you know, as if, you know, I have had those moments. There's a disbelief in the possibility of someone like me in the sense of where I'm coming from, what my background was. So for a lot of people to explain that to themselves meant that something was off. I was not telling the truth about something that could make them feel, you know. And, you know, so I was a kid coming from this difficulty, and probably there are people who have been trying to write a book all their lives in normal circumstances, nothing has been disrupted, they couldn't do it. And here comes this kid who went through all this thing and he's just writing his books and like something is off, you know? So they've got to find an explanation instead of just believing that, well, maybe he's just an intelligent guy. Why don't we just leave it at that, you know? I don't know, whatever the case is. Anyway. But here you
I'll
are.
never fully understand people and their motivation. Let's see, Sarah has asked, knowing your background, childhood and adulthood in connection to crisis, what advice might you give young people and us old people on how to retain hopeful optimism despite living through so much heartache, sorrow, and fear? You are clearly a man of great joy.
Yes, I am. I have my own moments of losing it and all of those things. But I've seen when people embrace completely the worst side of humanity, but I've also seen equally on the other side when people show the beautiful side of humanity. So, and that always gives me hope, and I believe that how you survive any crisis is dependent on your attitude in the process of the crisis itself, what you choose to do. For example, I think a lot of people, when COVID started, and then what's going on right now, um, probably are just waiting for when things will get back to normal. In crisis, this is the worst possible thing you can do, because that waiting is going to torment you more than anything. What you should be doing is more thinking, how do I function in this new reality? How do I look at myself? What is it that I can do? How do I relook at my life, reevaluate what I haven't done, things that I could have done differently, and all of these things? What am I grateful for? What could I celebrate? All of these things. If you think that way, you're more likely to come out of this changed. If you're just waiting, which is what most people do in crisis, they just wait for things to get back to normal. Things will never get back to normal the way they have been. It's going to change a little bit. And if you're not changed, you're going to struggle with it. I learned this the hard way. So this is my advice I'm giving to people. You cannot come back out of this the same way. I also know that I'm not, I also know human beings are very forgetful. We may walk out the door and go back to doing the very same things we did before all of this. So, but your attitude is very important. For example, I have a friend who lived in New York, and I called him when this whole COVID business started and other things. And each time I called him and tried to FaceTime him, he'll be in bed. And he said, oh, I don't feel good. And I'm like, that's exactly your attitude. Because the world is closed, you choose to stay in bed. Wake up every morning, take a shower, brush your teeth, do those things, and sit down, and then do whatever it is you usually do when you have to leave your house. But if you just stay in your pajamas all day, even that attitude is going to bring you down. It'll be cute for 1 or 2, 3 days, but after a while, you start to become, it's also even darken your own mood. So it's in the process of the crisis, what we choose to do determines how we come out of it. So that's the advice that I would give to people. And that's where the hope is. That's the shred of hope. That's where it lies, the possibility. Hold on to that little possibility, but also to question ourselves, to look at what have we done? What can we do differently? Where are we now? Why are certain things happening? And going back to what I said earlier, have we been participating in being each other's keepers as human beings? What each of us have been doing to make that? Because if you don't feel like you're part of that, then basically it's going to be bad. So yeah, anyway. At the same time, Sarah, I also want to say that I'm also still learning about life. So I don't have all the answers. So also be open to the possibilities of discovering things that you may not know about yourself, and yeah.
Getting back to the book, but sort of tying in with that, I think I must have read somewhere that you said dehumanizing children is a relatively easy task. It's coming back into society that's the hardest part. So I'm curious about the end of the book. Sorry for anybody who's not quite there. We'll try not to spoil it too much, but I'm curious about your thoughts where you leave the story. Do you have in your head where Kurumada might have gone, what she grew up to be. It's, to me, it ends on a hopeful note. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are if she is going to be able to re-enter society or enter society and heal.
Mm. I've always been one that does not like to write books that have that very nice wrapped ending, you know, because I feel like life is not like that, you know, and that life is constantly restarting itself one way or the other, right? So I always want to leave it at those moments where the possibilities are greater, and then, but you don't know what would happen next, right? So yes, she could be good, but she will still face certain difficulties, whatnot, or maybe she'll choose to do, I don't know. So I do also, when I write, I want to honor the intelligence of my readers. I don't want to give them everything because I feel like they also can draw their own conclusions. And this comes from the technique in the oral tradition, where when you share a story, when you give it to people, you make them ownership of in the story. So they have a stake in the story, as opposed to just telling them everything about the story. And then usually when you do that, people read the story and they love, but then they forget. You've ever heard people be like, oh, I went to see that movie. I really loved it, but I can't remember what it was about. Or I read that book because there was no ownership in the story, that it didn't allow you spaces for you to take ownership of it. So when I write stories, I never, for example, in Little Family, realized that the backstory of the characters, I deliberately left most of it out. And as I've been giving these virtual book tours, when I ask people, so what do you think the backstory of, so for example, Eliman was? Most people on the spot will say exactly what I thought it was, even though I never said anything in the book. Again, going back to what I said, is because how we behave in the present says so much about our past. So for me, when I was writing it, I was emphasizing the present. Eliman reads a lot of books, even when these kids are struggling. So you can clearly draw the conclusion that he grew up in a household with books, which kind of gives away what type of family he grew up in and all of that. I didn't need to take that space in the story to explain that to you, you know. You kind of get it from his actions. So when I write, I want to leave those spaces so that my reader can also draw their own conclusions and own the story in their own way, even if it's not what I want, because once you read the story, it becomes yours. And I'm passing it on to you. So that's what I do usually in my stories. That's why they don't have those nice endings. And I know some people don't like it, but I think it's wonderful. Maybe I'm wrong.
I love the ending. I think it's perfect. Because I was so invested in those characters, and I do want to create my own my own life for them. So I loved the ending. Let's see. It looks like Laura had just put in a comment that is beautiful. The real tragedy of racism is all of the genius and brilliance that is not shared with us all. Thank you for your genius and sharing that with the world. This is a true joy to be in your presence, and you have my deepest gratitude.
Thank you.
Comes from all of us. Um, we have seen over the past few days, especially a lot of book lists being put out there, books on anti-racism. It is interesting working in the book industry, and there has been a shift certainly over the past few years of publishing more diverse voices, and especially in children's books, I think, too, which had been very whitewashed for a very long time. So I'm just curious, with your thoughts on oral history and storytelling being a medicine, being a healing agent. Are there any stories that you are turning to right now in this moment of crisis, or that you would recommend to other readers during this time?
Well, I mean, there are so many writers from, diverse backgrounds that you can find, for example, today we have Wyatt Tumor, whose book came out. We have Bennett, whose book came out as well. And, There are so many that are out there, you know, there's no shortage. I think the idea is that if you're interested in learning something more than what you know or what feels familiar, uh, there's no shortage. For me, um, what I've tried to do with my children, raising them and trying to learn how to be a father and to be a good one as much as possible, is to teach them to believe in their own mind, in their own capacity, in their own thoughts. Because I think often when we dehumanize people, it starts with having them disbelieve in their own worthiness. So for me, I've tried to strengthen that in them. And by going back to the roots of how I grew up, which is the oral tradition storytelling. So instead of first reading books to them, I tell them stories orally. And then I ask them to retell me those stories. So they learn to actually hear their own voice and what it feels like to have an idea and an opinion and to actually follow through it. So we do that a lot with them. And even when we read a book, we ask them, what did you think about the book? Recount the book in your own way, instead of just feeding them the idea and telling them the answers, you know, so that they learn. So that's how I've raised them, even before this crisis, to understand things. I also don't try to put their head in the sand. I protect them, but I don't try to put their head in the sand, because I know that they will face a world that is difficult. So they need to know about it early on. Not, you know, obviously I'm not in favor of traumatizing anyone. I went through one, so I know what it feels like. But I don't think you can protect people by not telling them the truth, particularly children. And children, I believe, are way more intelligent than we give them the benefit to understand. So, for example, when I decided to become a father, I thought to myself, listen, I told all my friends and family members, if you want to be in the lives of my children, you cannot talk, baby talk to them. You have to speak to them like a real human being with perfect sentences, talk to them because they have a brain that is working and functioning. If you belittle their intelligence, they're going to belittle themselves as well. So I made that clear to everybody. So I speak to my kids and I listen to what they have to say. So obviously they will have good vocabulary. They will have, you know, because so that's the medicine that I think every, you know, these are human beings who are absorbing everything that's around them, you know. So I try to find the best possible way to build their foundation by honoring their intelligence that's already there and just sparking it a little more. So for me, that's what I've done for my children. Now, as an African person, as a Black person, you know, sometimes it's difficult, even in the children's book world, to find books that you will read to your children that represent them. There's so much. I think when you become a parent, you really realize the shortage of representation of people who don't look like us in stories, you know, for children's stories. So I try to find those, and if I don't, then I tell them stories. In fact, I've been thinking maybe I should write some of the stories I heard from my grandmother as a child growing up, because this would be useful for my children to read. And if they have their own children, they can read it to them as well. And these are really the oral traditional stories that kind of ask you questions and make you think about your responsibility to the other, you know. In the West, where I've lived for a while and my kids are born here, I think we've come to push this idea of individuality so much that we've forgotten that we are part of a community as well, you know. How do anybody how do you come to be in this world? Is because two people decide to give birth to you and make that decision. So you come from a community, you don't come from an individual concept or value system. You come from people getting together to give birth to you, and grandmothers and everything, right? So what happened over the years is that in this culture, people have believed that I'm myself, I'm individual, I can do independent. And then now people are stuck at home sometimes by themselves and they're having issues, you know, because it's not just about talking to people. The very fact of seeing another human being walk past you has a lot to do with how you function for the rest of the day, that spirit, you know. And in the African concept, we have Ubuntu, which we've always said, I am because we are, you know. It's not just I am, you know. So I hope when we all live, so I try to teach my kids this, and we've had this, you know, a lot of difficulty, even in the Western education system. I have twins that are 3 years old. Very early on when they were in school, they wanted to separate them so that they can be individual. And I was like, they have the rest of their life to be individual. I want them to have a sense of family. So we fought very hard, my wife and I, be like, you can't separate them, you know, because they take care of each other in a way. They have different personalities, but they need to know their family, their community. You know, when they grow up, they can go off and do different things. But for now, that basis needs to be set. But you see, even in our institutions, early on, we start to separate people from each other so that there's this sort of almost dehumanizing element of competition. Competition is great, but it can be dehumanizing as well when it's just about me getting what I want and walking over everybody, which we've seen now to our own detriment. Yeah. Anyway.
So you have 3 children, ages 6 and younger, at home with you during this quarantine period?
Yes, we have a 6-year-old and we have twins, boy and girl that are 3, and my wife, and it's been wonderful, you know. We've had
Bless
to
your
be
heart.
their teachers. We've had to be their substitute teachers and teach them. So it's been wonderful to see how they're learning and all of these things. So for, you know, it's been wonderful for me. I mean, I think it's obviously, you know, again, where they're parents, we have to set the standard at home, right? If we wake up feeling defeated, that's gonna be the mood in the house, right?
Yeah.
But for me, I've been through so many things, so I also, you know, and one thing I wanted to say really about dehumanization is that, you know, often when we dehumanize other people is that we don't realize that when you dehumanize somebody else, in reverse, you dehumanize yourself. You know, I learned that by being in the war, you know, but people don't realize that. So they only think that prejudice or racism or all of these things is one way, but when you do it one way in reverse, you actually, you know, chip at the possibility of your own goodness as an individual, you know, or, you know, so, and then things become what they are now, you know, because at some point there's a breaking point in everything, you know, so, yeah.
I just can't imagine 3 children. I have one 4-year-old and she's uh, difficult enough sometimes. So that's amazing.
I went through war, so I think I had a little bit of training as well, you know, for this moment.
Sure.
Because they're like little commanders at home, basically telling you what you need to do.
That's great. So I do have another question here from someone asking more about writing your memoir. You referenced not taking notes while you're in the moment. Can you talk about the process of remembering the past and creating a narrative for your memoir?
Well, when I wanted to write a memoir, you know, it also came out of frustration, the memoir, because, you know, when I had been adopted in this family in the US, in New York, and I came to live with them, at the time, the idea of a child who was a child soldier was very new in the mindset of the international community. And so a lot of people were drawing a lot of conclusions. And these were people who basically had never met somebody like me, but yet they had already decided that someone like me as a child who was being introduced to violence at a very young age would not be intelligent. They had time bomb waiting to happen, that they will always embrace violence. If you take them in at some point, you're just going to lose it, and all of these things, right? But they've never met anybody like me, you know. So I was very frustrated because I thought if I didn't intervene, this sort of thinking would become the fact. And people would then hold on to it and believe it deeply that it would affect me and anybody else who comes from my experience. And because I was living safely and I had opportunity to education, I thought, what was my responsibility? So that was the reaction to that, was to write this book. Now, I didn't know what point I wanted to make in the beginning. So I just wrote everything I could remember. So I wrote it chronologically from when I remember I was a boy in my village, when things broke down. But once I finished writing it, which is also the oral tradition, which is the belief that every story has its own natural structure. You just have to be patient enough to find it. So then I realized that, okay, when I was running from the war, that's when I actually realized what the life that I had and how beautiful and special it was. Because when it was happening, it was just what it was. I didn't really pay attention to it. So then that became a structure in the book. As I was running, I remembered what I had lost, you know. And when I was in the war, I wasn't really thinking about the war because I needed to survive it. Similarly, we're all in COVID. Nobody's been obsessed with COVID because you're home. It's a reality in your life, you know. after this ends, maybe you will reflect on it. But now you're not sitting around and be like, let's reflect on COVID. You don't, you know. So that became another structure, because when I was in the war, I was just trying to survive. And after I came out of it, I was at a rehabilitation center. Then I started remembering and making sense of what has happened. So that's when I went on and then tried to piece things together, and also took a lot of things out that I didn't feel like it was necessary to share. And so then, yeah, that's how I was able to write the book.
So your books have been published in several countries around the world. Have they been published in Sierra Leone, and how have people reacted to especially your memoir?
Yes, my books have been published in a lot of places around the world, and in Sierra Leone for my first book and my second book. I decided that I would take them home because, you know, people have difficulties home in terms of just the governance we've had over the years, and that I didn't want a Sierra Leonean to pay money for my book necessarily, you know. So what I did is that I would buy a bunch of copies. I will get my publisher to give me some copies. I know. And I would take them with me to Sierra Leone whenever I go, and I would just put them in public libraries, in school libraries. I would just put them on the shelves if I leave them there, you know. And then people started reading them through that, you know. And then one newspaper had found a copy in one of these public spaces and kind of started to serialize the book. Like, so every week when the newspaper came out, they'll have a chapter of the book in it. Now, obviously, this is against copyright issues, but I thought it was really nice, you know? So I did not say anything. And so people will read. So I've actually been in Sierra Leone where I'm standing, and people are reading a chapter from my book, and they're arguing around it and discussing it. And I'm standing there because also, even in my own country, people don't expect a young person like me. When they think Ishmael Beah, they think I'm this older gentleman, you know. You know, so sometimes I'm right there in front of them, and you know, and they don't think it's me. And if I say, oh, but that's actually me, they'd be like, no, that can't be you, man. This guy is so big, you know, people know about him, you know. And I'm like, okay, so can you tell me about him? So I get great reviews about my work and who I am, because people don't believe that it's really me in my own country. So that's what it's been. For the newest book, I know, for example, the current Minister of Education in Sierra Leone is a friend of mine. And so he's read it, and he said, you know, he read it on Kindle. The current president of the country had contacted me on his birthday and said, you know, can you send me a PDF of your book? So I sent him a PDF because I can't mail a copy. So people are reading it, you know, so you will see. And anyway, so I try to, you know, so we'll see.
That's great. So I hate to ask the annoying question that I'm sure you hate getting asked on a book tour. Are you working on anything next?
Well, my editor actually asked me that question many months ago when the book was finalized. So he's just like, okay, the book is done. She was like, so what about the next book? I was like, you know, could I have some time to? But, you know, I learned from the first book that, you know, and for most first-time writers make the mistake that when you write your first book, you're finished with it, and then you said, okay, let me take some time off and relax. And it's so difficult to get into a new project, you know. You have to retrain those muscles again to sit down. So usually as soon as I finish a project, I move on to the next one immediately while I still have those muscles, and start writing it. And then I will just continue editing it as I get exhausted. But I have a 2-book deal with Riverhead, and the second book is actually that I'm working on is a sequel of the memoir. So finally they were able to get me to be like, it's about time. I avoided it for years, but so now I figured I will go back to it, you know. So and I think I'm ready to write. As you know, the first one ended when I had left my country, Sierra Leone. I was in a neighboring country, and the rest of the story never was really told. So, which I think is also a very interesting book to write now, because it really gives a sense of the expectations you have coming to America as an immigrant, and then becoming an American, and honestly being disappointed with what your dreams had been, you know, what you expected the place would look like. But also along the way, you see what the foundation of this nation was built upon and what it should be, but how it's certain things have gone off the rails a bit. For example, I remember, when you're becoming a citizen in the United States, you take this citizen test where they ask you questions about US history, US politics. Probably most Americans born here would fail that exam because they don't even know that. But as an immigrant, you have to study for this stuff. And really, so I was reading the Federalist Papers, I was reading speeches from Abraham Lincoln. I was so ready. And the guy asked me the silliest questions you can think of. And I thought to myself, well, really? That's all it takes? He basically said, so what is the name of the ocean in the East Coast of the United States? And I'm like, really? And what's the one in the West Coast? And then he was like, what do we do on April 15th? We pay our taxes. We're like, good for you. I was like, seriously? And I was like, all right, I guess, we know. So this is the making of a citizen. I was like, all right. But I still loved reading the foundation and the beliefs that created what this country is. And you can see where it's gone off the rail and the possibilities that still lay ahead. I don't think institutions were built enough that I don't think it's completely gone off the rail because of that. As somebody coming from certain places where there are no institutions, things crumble so quickly, right? But the crumbling here has been so slow because of certain institutions. And those institutions now we're learning have favored a certain way of thinking or feeling about certain people that are now crumbling. So maybe the renewal will go back to the foundational principles of what this country was really about, hopefully.
And,
If not, the renewal will be something different from what we have now. So at least, So.
Well, hopefully be a little bit better too, maybe a little bit more inclusive.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I want to give everybody a chance to type in any last questions you might have, but I don't want to keep everyone here all night. I guess I'm wondering, I feel like the role of writers, it's such an important role and such an opportunity to use your voice. And especially, right now. So what are you hoping people will find in Little Family? What are your hopes for readers? What do you hope that they see in your book?
Well, I mean, there are several things, but I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that I always write to open a small window into the lives of the other. We seem it's not like us. I hope people will see familiarity. Even though the names may be different, they may not be John or Sam or their Kudimat and Namsa, that you will still find the humanity that is familiar to you. You will see it in them. You will see their desire to love, to take care of one another, to be funny, to laugh, to have a heartbreak, all of these things that are familiar to us, to be intelligent, that they are not just for a certain group of people, they are human. I hope you'll be able to pull that from it, and to understand that all, again, as I mentioned earlier, once we forget and belittle other people's humanity, eventually the entirety of humanity itself is going to crumble one way or the other. This has repeated itself throughout history over and over again, but we keep forgetting, And, at the beginning, you mentioned earlier how a lot of people are they're buying books now and reading books about how to be anti-racist, how to be this, how to be that, If it took you this time to be able to buy a book to read it, then you should ask yourself a question about that as well. I think if we really want to move on from this moment, we should be honest. Why did it take this moment for me to see that there has been injustice and prejudice going on? Because for some of us who look like I look, this is not news. This has always been going on. Now we have cameras that can show it, but this is always gone on. There's been always microaggressions that have led to this monumental one. I'll give you an example. I live in Santa Monica here when we first moved to LA, and one evening, this is not the first time, many times. In fact, let me take it way back to when I had published my first book and I had some money. I was so excited. I bought myself a nice car and I was excited. As soon as I drove it off the dealership, I was pulled over. And the first question that was asked was, is this your car? Most of you, when you get pulled over, I'm sure nobody asks you that. They will tell you what you did, not. So when you ask that question, the assumption is that I stole the car immediately. So you're criminalized just by how you look, by certain things you cannot even have access to. When I travel, most of the time when I travel for work, if I'm flying business class, which I do most of the time, because I can afford it, but also because if a company hire me, they can pay for it. But I can tell you almost every time when I stand in line to go get my ticket, as soon as I'm standing in line, the person at the desk will say, "Excuse me, sir, this is the line for business class," which is basically saying that you cannot be in this line. And I always say to them, "Well, thank you, I can read. But why don't you wait for me to reach and check?" You know, but if I didn't look the way I look, that question would not be asked. So the prejudice, these microaggressions are happening on a daily basis, to the point that people choke at some point. They can't take it anymore, you know. One last anecdote that I'll tell you is that, you know, on a plane once, I was coming from Paris to Atlanta for a talk. I was living in Paris at the time and I was in business class and somebody had stowed away in business class, you know. And immediately they thought it was me because I was the only person who looked like me in that business class. And I laughed because I thought to myself, clearly I'm not going to do that because I stand out already. Everybody's already looking at me like I don't belong there. So why would I even be doing that, you know? But you realize that and it turned out that it was a white person who would do it because they feel entitled. So what I'm saying to you is that if we really want to honor this moment that's going on, we have to be honest at how we've allowed ourselves to think and feel of the other. And how we have also contributed to that, you know. In the words of MLK, I would paraphrase a little bit, it says that, you know, in the end, you know, we will not really remember the blows or the harshness from our enemies, but rather from the silence of our friends, you know. And I think there are a lot of liberals in the middle who are not like that, but yet they've benefited from a system that's like that because it favors them. And so they kind of turn a blind eye to allow it to happen, you know? So in a way, we have to be honest with ourselves, truly, and ask ourselves questions. You know, like I said, you know, I'm a Black person from an African country, but I was adopted in a white Jewish family. I grew up with them, I love them. But we've been having these conversations with them as well, saying that we have to look, you know, there are certain expectations you had of me, and it was only based on the fact that you thought because of how I looked like, you know, even though you loved me, you still has. When I was in university, one of my professors thought I plagiarized a paper because it was too good for somebody like me to write, you know. So at every level of your life as a Black person, you face these things. It's not just, you know, when you get pulled over. I was mentioning earlier, like in Santa Monica, when I was pulled over, there was immediately a spotlight put on, and the officer went on the other side, the other one went on the side. I was in the car with my wife, and they were already holding their gun. And all because we were driving a car that they didn't think we could afford, and therefore we must have stolen it, right? But when you pull somebody over and you're already holding your weapon, you don't even know the history of that person. I come from war, so I'm already triggered in so many levels, right? But this person is criminalizing me. And so they came in and said, license registration. I'll be like, you know, I don't want to reach for it because I don't want you to shoot me for no reason, right? So this has been going on. Now we have the cameras, we can see it. We're all uncomfortable about it. I do hope we're all honest with ourselves about how we really see this moment. Anyway, thank you for listening. I appreciate.
Thank you.
You know, appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us. And thank you for this. If you haven't read Little Family yet, I'm sure you will now. Thank you so much for being here with us, everyone. Thank you, Ishmael, so much for taking the time with us. It was truly a pleasure. I really hope that maybe we won't return to what was our normal, but maybe we'll return to something better. And in that time, I do hope that we'll see you eventually in North Carolina.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to coming. My cousin used to live in North Carolina, actually, Winston. So I've been there many times. So
Well, good.
hopefully I will come. I am
Okay,
sure this too shall pass and we would all, hopefully we'll find the best of ourselves after this. So
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate it. Thank you everybody for coming. And stay well, stay safe, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you again soon.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.